Welcome to Food Friends, a podcast inspiring home cooks to try new dishes in the kitchen by sharing trusted recipes, tips, and friendship. Hi, I'm Sonia.
And I'm Carrie. We met in Los Angeles over 15 years ago as personal chefs and haven't stopped talking about food since. We're so glad you're here. Thanks for being our food friend.
If you enjoyed our podcast, please subscribe, leave us a review, and share this episode with friends. We love hearing from you, so follow us on Instagram or drop us a line at foodfriendspodcast.com.
Yes, we'd love to hear from you and your food friends. Happy cooking and eating. Hi, Sonia.
Hi, Carrie. Well, it's no secret that we're obsessed with the farmers market. As you know, have been doing tours all summer here in Portland, often with amazing...
All those lucky people.
Well, often with food friends. Food friends listeners
Yes.
have been coming along, and it's been so fun to meet people. But I think when I'm doing the tour, I'm often thinking about what we do for each other and how we talk about the farmers market and how we have been talking about the farmers market for almost 20 years. Yeah. Because what we do naturally, and now we do it on the podcast, is we talk about what we're buying and what we're making with it. So these are some of my favorite episodes that we do all year.
I agree. It also helps to be reminded of the seasonality of some items. It's like we're saying goodbye to the berries, the peaches, all these summer flavors. And so I'm excited to get into it and find out, what do you have on your mind to be making from the farmers market this season?
You know, I'm a fall person. It's my absolute favorite season.
Same.
It's just the best time of year for me. I'm not quite a summer person as much as I love summer produce. It's not a secret. But anyway, so yes, I have a list of things I'm really excited about, that some of which is still available in summer, but really starts coming to the forefront in fall. And we are in this time of year right now, September, where it's that bridge season, where there's things that are kind of at their peak in all these different categories. So peppers is one of those things that here in the Northwest are at the market until December, really until official end of winter.
You keep peppers until December?
They grow here. Yeah.
They're still growing.
They're still growing. And I've heard that's true on the East Coast too. Like my friends in New England will be like, oh yeah, I can get peppers until December, which as a home gardener, I don't totally get, but that is great. And so one of my favorite peppers that we don't talk about that much is shishito peppers. Don't you love
a shishito? Right? I do. I discovered it when I was a personal chef. I definitely didn't grow up eating any kind of pepper like that, but I'm so charmed by shishitos because it's a little bit of like playing Russian roulette. What is it? 1 in 10 is spicy?
1 in 10 is spicy. Yeah. And they're so cute. And they're great as an appetizer, just like roasted on their own. But there's this recipe that I discovered that really reminded me of you and is a really fun way to use shishito. When you were briefly living in Montreal, I briefly had some work in Montreal that coincided, which is just wild. We were there at the same time. So I found this recipe by Justin Chappell for Food and Wine that's peri peri chicken and shishito skewers. And before I just tell you briefly about the recipe, going back to you and the inspiration, it's this Portuguese recipe that ended up becoming popular in African colonies and then has kind of become popular all over the world. And it's a spice blend with chilies, fresh chilies, almost like you're making a kind of salsa that you marinate the chicken in. And then people also make a little bit of a hot sauce from it and they serve it with the chicken. And you took me to this Portuguese chicken place.
Oh yes, I remember. I can still remember the smell of that place. It was so incredible.
It was so incredible. It was like rotisserie chickens, but not like you've ever had before, with this incredible spicy but not too spicy sauce, very pepper forward. If you're ever in Montreal, there's a whole neighborhood sort of that's full
like a
of
Portuguese neighborhood full of these great little rotisserie chicken places. And they also had this incredible bread. So you could get kind of this like juicy chicken and put the sauce on the bread. And I knew when you got to town that was like one of the first places I wanted to take you. So I love that you're bringing this back to our conversation.
So this recipe to me kind of recreates that memory, but it also is just a fun way to use shishitos. What you do is you take chicken and you marinate it in a homemade peri peri sauce. Although you can find pre-made versions of the sauce. So if you don't feel like making your own, I would say that would be a good shortcut. It does want you to marinate the chicken for a couple hours, but the cooking time is 25 minutes or less. And I love that. So I do think I consider this a simple recipe, even though it has that marinating step. And I also feel like if you didn't want those spicy flavors, even the idea of skewered chicken and shishitos, I think is really cute. And we'll link the recipe in our show notes, but you'll see the visual. It's like you take two skewers, and so you have each end of the little pepper skewered, and then chicken between the pepper, and then more peppers, and more chicken, and like a kebab. And I just love that presentation. And you could do this on a grill, or you could do this in a cast iron skillet or a grill pan. I think it'd be a lovely like starter. I think it'd be a lovely main course. I think you could even make it ahead and reheat it if you had to. It just is a kind of simple, fun dish.
I was so glad you used the word simple because I didn't want to feel like I was oversimplifying what you're sharing. But basically, you're talking about a protein and a vegetable. But you have this really flavorful marinade, and then you have these really great shishitos, and putting them on a skewer is fun. So this could be something as easy for a weeknight meal, but to me, this could also be for a dinner party or an appetizer if you were hosting some people and you wanted something that people could kind of stand and eat. It seems like such a fun dish. And I love that it traces back to our time together in Montreal, which is really fun.
I mean, that makes food that much more special. What's your first farmer's market must have this fall?
So my first farmer's market must have is figs. The reason I'm bringing up figs is because when I was a personal chef, I would buy them for my clients and I would put them on cheese boards. But aside from just kind of eating them like out of hand or maybe putting them into a salad, I've sort of lost my way with figs. But I found this recipe for baked figs with balsamic and feta. And one of the first things that the recipe says is this is for like your overripe and smushy figs, which I find when you're buying a bunch of stuff at the farmer's market, figs or berries or these soft items, they tend to be the casualty. I generally don't buy the figs because I'm worried about them getting bruised or not making it home. And so this kind
Wait, can I stop you for a second with my hack for that?
Yes,
what I do.
Yes, tell me your hack.
And it's gonna be so obvious. You're gonna be like, oh, of course. I feel like you already do this, but I started seeing these other people at the farmers market bringing in Tupperwares and sometimes even egg containers to bring their figs
in. That's brilliant. I never thought to put my figs in an egg carton. That's so smart because then they don't even touch each other.
It'd be good for something where you cook figs because egg cartons can be contaminated if they're not clean.
True. Yeah.
But if you also lined your egg thing, like they just perfectly nestle it. And when I can remember to bring Tupperware to the farmer's market, which I'm not saying I do all the time, I'm always so glad I did because especially with those really soft berries, those little containers they come in aren't protective enough.
And I also sometimes rinse out a plastic lettuce container and I'll put things in there too. I've
seen you do that. Yeah.
I've done that, especially with things like plums or peaches. I want them in a single layer and then you can kind of stack them on top of each other. Anyway, so this recipe is from Food 52 and you're basically putting figs, balsamic, a little bit of garlic and feta, but you can also sub in a creamy goat cheese because one of the things that the recipe developer mentions is that the feta, when you put it in the oven, can dry out. So they suggest that you marinate the feta for 3 hours or overnight with a little bit of olive oil and a little bit of garlic. And then you take that garlic out of the marinade and it adds like a tiny bit of garlic savoriness with that balsamic. So this is kind of sweet, salty, creamy. I will say over the summer, I developed that recipe for the West Coast Niçoise salad that has a marinated goat cheese. And I still have some of that marinated goat cheese in my fridge that also has a little bit of garlic in it. So that's what I would use here too. So
for sure.
I don't think you have to, this is more of a recipe idea than it is an actual recipe. So figs, balsamic, garlic, goat cheese, feta, some olive oil, stick it in the oven, let the figs get soft. And at the very end, you broil it. And then the suggestion is that you can smush this on bread, which of course I would do in a heartbeat. I love a crostini. I love something cheesy and sweet and juicy to put on top of a crostini. But you could also put this on a salad. I feel like you could put this on an arugula salad, a radicchio salad, something that had like a bite to it. That would also be a beautiful way to use this baked figs.
I'm so glad you had figs on your list because it's definitely on mine. But I often am just eating it out of hand or I make a jam or something with figs and it grows a lot here. So sometimes I'll get figs from a friend or something. But this is such a simple recipe that's kind of timeless. And yeah, I've done versions of this before where like I've stuffed figs with cheese and wrapped them with something. You know, you can do those
But
sort of
that's so
like, it's so
tedious, you
tedious.
know?
I love this sort of communal rustic thing. And also, I think you know this, but I have a new personal chef client and I'm personal chefing for the first time in a very long time,
Yeah.
which has been so interesting. But this is perfect for her because she loves things that are sort of a bite of protein with some kind of produce. And you could make this and have this as a snack. Like I'm thinking of just having a little container of figs and feta for her to snack on really
Yeah.
simply. And but it's nice enough that it could be an appetizer at a dinner party.
Absolutely. One of the things that I forgot to add to this recipe is that you add a little bit of thyme when they're cooking in the oven. And then at the end, they suggest that you either garnish with mint or parsley. I think you could garnish with what you had on hand, but I love the idea of the mint because I think that that would just really brighten up this whole dish.
When you were talking, I was thinking I would add mint or basil, but I think herbs
Oh,
in this
yeah.
would be really good regardless. So, when I'm thinking about fall produce, especially in the Pacific Northwest, I can't exclude mushrooms. Mushrooms to me are symbolic of fall. They're what I get excited about, especially as we get into October, November. But mushroom season really starts very, very soon. And of course, you can find mushrooms year round everywhere because they're cultivated year round. So when mushrooms are at their peak, I don't want to interfere with them, especially when I can get wild mushrooms. Like I want to keep the flavors of butter, garlic, a little white wine or a little bit of red wine vinegar. I just like to keep it so simple. So anything that highlights that flavor combination with the sauteed mushroom is what I'm looking for.
But Sonia, I have to interrupt you because I don't actually know if I reported back on this, but last year we talked about this mushroom dish from Smitten Kitchen where you bake all these
Yes.
mushrooms with like butter and garlic. And I think that you add a little bit of red wine vinegar at the end or something that lifts up the flavors. And I made that like 3 times. And
It's one of my favorite mushroom dishes of all time. We'll
yes,
link it
because you can
again. Yeah.
because you can also just with whatever mushrooms that you find. And so if you're at the farmers market and there's one of those incredible displays where you're like, I can't choose, I'm going to buy them all. It just they can all go into a baking dish with all these items and they're incredible. So you have something similar to this?
It also comes from Smitten Kitchen, but it's not a roasted mushroom. So that recipe is where you take a couple pounds of mushrooms and add some butter and capers and garlic and you stick
Oh
it in the
yeah, the
oven and
capers.
it's a
Yes.
perfect dish. I love that
Yeah.
dish. Everyone always raves about it when I serve it. This recipe also comes from Smitten Kitchen. It's a little bit of a different flavor combo, and it's called the simplest mushroom pasta. Because I have to say, a mushroom with some kind of starch or grain is often really what I like to do as
Oh yeah.
well. You know, I'll often mix it with rice or buckwheat or something, but pasta is so just delicious, especially on a chilly night.
Oh
And it's a
yeah.
very, she's like the name says it all. It's the simplest mushroom pasta. You're essentially sauteing mushrooms, a whole ton of them, with garlic, with butter, with a splash of white wine or some sherry, cooking sherry. It's very classic, it's very simple. And then you're sort of using some of the pasta water and you're making a sauce with your pasta. It's ultimately sauteed mushrooms with pasta, and then you could absolutely grate a ton of pecorino or a ton of parmesan or your favorite cheese into this. You can use her recipe as a starting point and go in any direction. And I think also in terms of the mushrooms, you could use the mushrooms she describes. I think she makes it mostly with cremini, but I personally would do this with chanterelles. I would do this with oyster mushrooms or trumpet mushrooms, with whatever kind of mushroom that you can find that's easy for you to use.
I mean, I think that's the key to a lot of what we're talking about here is using what you find. You don't have to have a specific ingredient. You don't have to have only shiitakes. You can just, whatever mushrooms you find, you can make this pasta. And there's something so satisfying about going to the farmer's market, discovering a few things, coming home and making this beautiful dinner.
That comes together in 30 minutes or so. But because there's so many mushrooms, it feels like a special occasion meal because mushrooms, I think, are a little bit of a treat.
Yeah, no, I agree. Well, Sonia, one of the other items I love to see at the farmers market in the fall is squash, especially when I have my cart because I hate carrying, heavy squash around. But if I've got the cart, I know I can pick up a few squash and they can sit out in my kitchen almost like a decoration in the fall. I usually keep a few of them out. And a squash that I really love is the spaghetti squash. And I found this recipe that really feels honestly so obvious, and I don't know why I didn't think of this before, but spaghetti squash parmesan. And it's exactly as you think it is. You cut your spaghetti squash in half, you roast it in the oven with a little bit of olive oil, a little bit of salt and pepper. When it comes out, you turn it over, drag your fork through to kind of make it spaghetti. You add marinara and a little bit of garlic powder, maybe a little bit of dried oregano, a little bit of dried basil. You add some cheese on top, you throw it back in the oven, and you eat it like that. And I don't know
Like
how
you
I
serve spaghetti squash halves, and it's
in
filled with that marinara and the cheese already in there.
it,
I love that
it's
idea.
it's such an easy side dish with those comforting flavors that I think you're really looking for. As a parent, I'm always like, okay, I can sell this idea. It's a vegetable, but it's got cheese and marinara that my son already likes. And yes, I like to make my own marinara. I also like to use Rayo's. You can also do this on a Sunday and just reheat it during the week.
Yeah, I was always big into spaghetti squash when I was personal chefing way back in the day because there was sort of like a fad of it, especially as a replacement for actual spaghetti. But it's not actual spaghetti. It's a lot more watery, it's a lot more vegetable tasting. I think it's important to know that. And I like the idea of stuffed squashes in general. So I don't feel like you're describing something that's trying to pretend to be spaghetti. I think you're
No,
describing a stuffed
yeah.
squash that's cheesy, that has tomato, and satisfies all those flavors, but still it's not trying to be something it's not.
I think it just becomes this really decadent side. It's funny that you mentioned you used to cook with spaghetti squash back in the day. I'm pretty sure the recipe developer that I found this recipe for, she was like, this kind of feels like it outdated from like 2009 or something. And she was like, I used to cook it all the time and then I kind of forgot about it. And now I've come back to it. And I just thought, what a great invitation to pick up a spaghetti squash, which you can also get at the grocery store.
This is definitely not a squash from 2009, but my farmer's market squash must have our honey nut squash. And
Oh,
that's
yeah.
definitely been, I think, because it was cultivated. I can't remember if it was affiliated with Dan Barber's farm or through Cornell or whoever started
It feels
breeding.
newer though. It's
It
kind
is,
of like a
no,
new squash,
it
right?
is factually a
Oh,
newer
wow.
squash, yeah, that has been bred for. It's much sweeter. It's actually much less watery because even roasted, there's still a lot of moisture in a lot of squash. So this one tends to, I think, have a little less moisture. You don't even have to peel it. You can eat the skin. It's a little thinner. There's a lot of things to like about honey nut squash. The reason I like it is actually its flavor. I think it's more flavorful and it's naturally sweeter, and I kind of have a sweet tooth, so I lean that way. And I also think it just cooks a lot quicker than butternut squash because they're tinier. There's usually honey nut squash are much
Right.
smaller. Sometimes they're a little big, but like you saying you didn't want to carry around your big squash around the market, that's also part of why I'm drawn to honey nut squash and delicata squash because you can grab a few small ones and just stick them at the bottom of your bag, and it's not that hard to
Yeah.
truck home with them.
Good
So
point.
I love the honey nut squash just roasted, but I found this really great recipe from Justine Duran, who we've had on the show, of Justine
Yeah.
Snacks. I feel like she also is a big honey nut squash person. She has many honey nut squash recipes.
Yes.
And so she has this one that combines two of my favorite ingredients, squash and beans. It's called honey nut squash brothy beans. And I would say this isn't a recipe, again, that's not a 30-minute meal, but to me, it feels like a really good weekend recipe that you could even make ahead and have through the week. So, what you do is you roast your squash with a whole head of garlic that you wrap in foil. So, you're
Oh,
like,
yum. So your
you're
kitchen's
making
already smelling amazing.
totally. And then you
Yeah.
scoop that squash and that garlic and you can puree it together. And I think she does a food processor, but I think you could do an immersion blender or even a fork. I don't think this has to be silky smooth. And then she adds vegetable stock or broth to this. It's not quite a soup, which I also really like. I like that she's specifically calling it brothy beans as opposed to soup, because I do think there's a distinction. Although I know you like your soups thicker and brothier. It's something I've learned
Yeah.
about you over the years, that
Yes,
you're
it's
like,
true. We've
and I,
had a couple of rows about this.
well, I realized, I don't think I've ever said this, but I realized that sometimes when you would include stews on our soup roundups, it's because I started reading your recipes that you were developing for soups, and I actually think you use less broth in your soups than most people, which I don't think is,
Yes.
I think this is a style thing. I think you're allowed to want a stewier
Right.
soup, or but
A
for me,
thicker. I like it
because
slightly thicker. So I feel like this is a recipe I would
you
love.
would love it. And for me, though, my OCD brain is like stew is stew and soup is soup. And, I get all nitpicky with myself about it. So, anyway, I like that she calls it brothy beans and not a soup. So, you roast all that. You make a kind of thick broth with the honey nut squash. And then you're adding canned butter beans or canned cannellini beans. She has a white bean with this. And so after you make this little broth in a separate pan, and again, separate pan, it's not your favorite, Carrie, but I think it's worth it. You're sauteing some onions and you add some Calabrian chili and you add the beans to that. And so you make kind of oniony, aromatic, pepper infused beans, which you could do with fresh or canned beans. And then you add that to the broth. And I love this idea because I often combine roasted squash with brothy beans. I'll make a pot of brothy beans. I'll roast wedges of squash. I'll serve that together. And this just takes it to the next level.
I just love that idea. It sounds so comforting. And I think to your point, it seems like a great weekend recipe to work with, especially when it's started to get really cold or Sunday when it's raining.
Absolutely.
Well, Sonia, I also have a beans recipe that I want to share with you. And this one is a mixed bean salad with tarragon and celery. And it comes from a cookbook that you gave me, Six Seasons by Joshua McFadden. And we've talked about a lot of recipes from his cookbook. I went to a couple of my sort of seasonal farmers market inspired cookbooks when I was thinking about what recipes would I want to be cooking from the farmers market this fall. So you pick up whatever beans you see at the market, your wax beans, your romanos, green beans, and if you see any of the shelling beans as well. And so then when you come home, you cook your shelling beans. Usually I think you can cook them in like 20 or 30 minutes. You pull them out of the shell, you simmer them, correct? Is that how you do them?
Yeah, the one that I see the most in the fall here are cranberry beans.
Same.
There are certainly others, but I feel like at farmers markets around the country, that's a popular one. And all you do is you take them out of the shell and you add them to some kind of liquid, whether that's water or stock, and you simmer them. And they take a third of the time of a dry bean.
Yes.
So it can be between 20 and 40 minutes, depending on the freshness of the bean and the size of the bean.
Yeah, and you just want to test them as you go.
Yeah.
You have always talked about shelling beans, and I would always see them and be a little bit intimidated, but it's really just a regular bean. You're just cooking it for a less amount of time. And then with whatever wax beans, green beans, Romano beans that you find at the market, you just want to blanch those until crisp tender and then shock them in cold water and then get them dried off. The rest of the salad is pretty simple, but it all kind of speaks to what's already at the farmer's market in the fall and is really beautiful. So lots of celery. He calls for the inner stalks as well as the leaves, which reminds me of you. I feel like you use celery leaves.
I
a
love
lot more
celery
often.
leaves, and I love inner stalks for salad. So I keep the tougher
Yes.
outer stalks for soups and stock, like chicken
Yes,
stock.
and cooking if you're
Yes.
like using it in a mirepoix or something. But
And the
those
tender ones for
inner
salads are so good.
are so good. And so he also calls for a whole bunch of parsley if you buy a big bunch of parsley and chop that up. Also, a half a cup of tarragon.
Oh, I love that.
So much tarragon. That's a lot of tarragon.
That's
Like
a
standing
lot
there
of
pulling all
tarragon.
those leaves. He says that it doesn't have to be fully packed in scallion, a little bit of olive oil, and then he calls for pepperoncinis and capers. And he recommends that you take a little bit of the pepperoncini juice and kind of drizzle it over the salad. And then you serve it with soft cooked eggs.
Oh, so it's really like a complete meal.
It's very niçoise-ish, but without any olives, which of course, if you really liked a niçoise olive or any kind of olive, then you could add an olive to it.
And it needs some tuna, but it could have some tuna and then become niçoise. I think that sounds incredible. I love that cookbook. I've tried a lot of recipes, but I've never tried this one. And I am such in my tarragon era that I feel like I'll definitely be making this. One thing about celery, did you know that you can store it wrapped in foil and it lasts like 10 times longer?
No. What do you mean?
I don't personally do this, but when I was visiting my friends Greg and Jordan, who just are
Yes,
lovely, my
I love.
lovely
Yes.
friends, and Jordan had his celery, he's the cook in the house, wrapped in foil, and it reminded me of like, oh yeah, Jordan's doing that because it actually they don't go through produce very fast, and it does keep it that much longer. So I don't know what the science is behind that, but if you are slow to use your bunch of celery, that's a way to preserve it for longer. It really does work.
We go through celery so fast in my
It's
house. I
not an
just
issue for
like,
you.
yeah,
I
it's
don't
not an issue.
either, but I'm just saying some people don't.
That's
And
so
they don't want to get
funny.
a whole bunch, especially from the
Yeah.
farmer's market where it's a little bit more valuable. And then that's
Yeah.
a way to keep it longer. Okay.
Great tip.
Well, I mean, thank you, Jordan, for reminding me of that.
Yes.
Another thing that comes out in the fall and colder months, and I would say it gets even better later in the fall, is radicchio. Now you can kind of find radicchio year round, but its season is really late fall and winter, and it tastes better then. It's actually less bitter in the colder
Right.
months. There's this restaurant in Portland called Nostrana. It's an Italian restaurant. It's been around for, I don't know, I think over 20 years. I could be wrong. It's been around a long time. It's like one of those institutions. The chef of Nostrana is this amazing woman named Kathy Wim. She actually just came out with a cookbook this past summer, about summer Italian cooking. But anyway, Nostrana is one of my favorite Portland institutions. They have this very famous salad in town that is their radicchio salad. And I can't say that it's so different than any other sort of like Caesary salad or other radicchio salads, but I do feel like it is somehow each ingredient matters, and you'll just leave that restaurant thinking about it. And luckily, she shared the recipe online,
Oh,
so
how
we can
great.
share it with
Okay.
everyone.
So what's in the
So,
recipe? I'm so curious because I think sometimes it's nice to be just reminded of
yes,
these classic dishes that we make. So
it's
what's in
just
this
about what
radicchio
you
salad?
Yeah, so this radicchio salad, and also she suggests in the recipe itself that it could be served as is or as a bed for grilled boneless chicken breasts, fish
Oh,
kebabs, or shrimp. So I love that direction too. Aside from radicchio, she has you cube some herbed focaccia or crusty country sourdough bread. So you're basically making a crouton. And for that, you're going to need butter and sage and rosemary and garlic. And then the
all those
dressing,
fall flavors.
yeah, and then the
Yeah.
dressing is red wine vinegar, a little bit of white wine vinegar too. And I get that because two different vinegars actually can have different flavors and acidity levels. Mayonnaise, anchovies, and extra virgin olive oil, and then a half cup of grated Parmigiano Reggiano. And she gives a lot of chefy notes, like you break apart the radicchio and you cut it into certain size pieces and you put it in ice water. And then while it's chilling and crisping up, that's when you make your croutons. And then once they're cool, you make your dressing with the garlic, the vinegar, mayonnaise, anchovies, and olive oil, and you do that in a food processor. So you're making Caesar dressing essentially.
Yeah, I was
And
about to
then
say this has like Caesar vibes, but there
it's
are
a
some
Caesar.
yeah, it's a Caesar, but there's some differences. There's something about that bitterness and then a little bit of the cheese, the richness of the mayonnaise, the anchovies. These are all beautiful flavors to be putting on a leaf of radicchio.
And I think at the restaurant they do homemade aioli, so they make their own mayonnaise.
Yeah.
But also, I'd say what makes it different from a Caesar's, there's no Dijon mustard. So
Yeah.
it's such a great salad. It's one of my favorite ways to use radicchio. I plan to make this through the fall, through the winter, and beyond.
I'm absolutely going to pick up some radicchio and make that as well. This may surprise you, but I'm actually bringing a second salad to the table today. I'm kind of wooed by kohlrabi, and every time I see it, I think like, what am I going to do with that? I just buy it and then I want it and I peel it and I'll sort of eat it like you would eat a carrot or a piece of celery, but there's this really beautiful cookbook that I was gifted many years ago called The Broad Fork by Hugh Etchison. It's similar to Joshua McFadden's cookbook where it's done by the seasons. I do want to read one of the things that he writes in the notes, which is he said, I used to work with this chef. I always remember her describing marjoram as the sweet, good natured daughter of thyme and oregano. So this recipe has kohlrabi with pecans, lime, paprika, and fresh marjoram. And I
Oh,
also, these are all things that you
interesting.
can find at the farmer's market that you see and you just think like, well, what am I going to do with marjoram? What am I going to do with kohlrabi? This is such a simple salad, but with a couple of really great chefy tips. You take a mason jar, you take your lime juice, your olive oil, your paprika, your marjoram, and a shallot, and you put it in a jar and you shake it up and you peel your kohlrabi into half moon shapes and you put that in a bowl and you take half of the vinaigrette and you let it sit for like maybe 30 minutes to an hour just to soften up a little bit.
So when you say peel the kohlrabi, you mean like you're slicing very thin half moons, or you're saying you peel it and then you slice it?
Yeah, you peel the outside of the kohlrabi.
Right.
You have to, it's a vegetable that you do have to spend a little bit of time peeling. And then then you can cut it in half and thinly slice half moons once you've
Yes.
peeled the outside of it.
Okay.
And then you put it in a little bit of the dressing. And then when you go to serve the salad, you mix the marinated kohlrabi with a little bit of arugula and some toasted pecans. And then you drizzle a little bit more of that vinaigrette over the top of it. And it's really so simple, but yet so fresh from the farmer's market.
But who doesn't want simple? I think we're all looking for simple that pays off. And I also think a lot of us don't know what to do with a kohlrabi once we get home. Like you said, you see it, it looks so beautiful. It's purple or green and it's a lovely vegetable. And then you get it home and you're like, okay, what do I do with this thing? And I think having salad recipes for it, like I want to try the salad. I love the idea of adding marjoram. I never use that. And pecans, I love in a salad. Everything you described sounds delicious. I think this sounds like a lovely salad that can carry you also into winter, not just for fall. It's interesting. Kohlrabi even shows up at the summer farmers market, weirdly.
Oh,
But
interesting.
it really tastes better the colder it gets outside because it gets sweeter. Like a lot of these root vegetables, like carrots, get sweeter in the fall and winter. And so, anyway, I love this idea.
Sonia, I think it's time for us to move on to dessert. And I'm really excited to hear what desserts you're wanting to make from the farmer's market this season.
I want to make desserts that are rustic and embrace something extremely seasonal. And I just love pears. I feel like there's a short window for pears when they're really good. It's like a couple months in the fall. And they're so beautiful too. And I always end up buying more than I can eat just
Yes.
simply. And then I have extra and I don't want them to go bad. So I always love to make simple pear cakes. And this fall, there's one that I really love. You know, I think I've shared before the chocolate chunk pear cake I made from Smitten Kitchen.
Yes, I made that last year.
It's really good. But
It's really good.
the one this fall, I don't think it's going to surprise you. It's a pear almond cake. You know how I'm loving my almond cakes. The other thing about this recipe, it's from David Tanis. It's for New York Times Cooking. We've already talked about before how David Tanis always makes me think of you. I think he also is someone who really knows how to embrace seasonal produce.
Yes, I agree.
That's like his forte. And what's great about this recipe is you don't need a stand mixer. You don't need to cream any butter and sugar
Really?
together. I love
Oh,
it.
I need this recipe.
It's like you whisk together eggs and melted butter and vanilla and almond extract. And then you also whisk together separately almond flour, sugar, salt, baking powder. So this is naturally gluten-free, which also I
Wow.
love. So you
Yeah.
so you
It
mix
has like
that.
the double almond flavor because you get it with the almond flour and then you also get it with the extract.
Exactly. And then you combine those batters, you put them in the bottom of a baking sheet, and you beautifully arrange pear slices on top. And then you just bake it. How easy does that sound?
That sounds so easy. It's even easier than the apple cake that I'm bringing to the table. And I found this recipe for a French apple cake because I think apples this time of year, I just can't buy enough of them. I think the key ingredient here is you add a little bit of rum.
Oh, yeah. That
And
sounds so
so
good.
it's a buttery cake with a little hint of rum, and then you just peel and slice your apples or you cut them into chunks. And the recipe is super straightforward. You make a standard cake batter. You do need a standing mixer or a hand mixer. You add a little bit of rum. If you don't want to use rum, I think you could use like a reduced apple cider. That's something that we talked to Sally McKinney about because that would really add a lot of flavor if you didn't want to add the rum. You bake this in a springform pan, and so there's just all these little pieces of apples in there. One of the things that the recipe developer notes is that it's also really versatile. You could eat this for breakfast. This feels like a snacking cake that we might find on your grandmother's counter.
Well, wait,
Um,
I have to stop you.
does she
Well,
have a
because
snacking
I've
cake like
shared this
this?
before, but it's probably been a minute. But you know, my number one fall cake and my one of my only recipes that went super viral was my grandmother's apple charlotte, which
Oh,
she always
yes.
made all fall, which is very similar to this French apple cake. The difference is her charlotte has no added oil or butter. It's
Oh.
just eggs and sugar, flour, apples. It's like a 5 ingredient one bowl cake. So I do think butter adds a sort of beautiful flavor to an apple cake. And I like to have these two as two different options of a similar cake.
When I was looking at it, I was like, wow, that looks like something that I recognize, but I'm not sure. I've never made it before. That must be what it reminds me of,
Yeah.
too. This would also be a beautiful cake at the end of a dinner party.
Who doesn't love an apple cake in the fall? I think it's like the national dish of fall.
Yes, I completely agree. And a pear cake, I think
And a pear cake.
you could easily sub pears in here, and I think that it would be really delicious.
That would totally work. And people have done that with my Charlotka recipe. And we'll link that one too, just so people can have both.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. I love that.
And just as a reminder, if you're in Portland or planning a visit, you can come on a tour of the farmers market. It has been so fun to bring people along and discover what's there. And during the fall, there's something new every single week. So we'll provide a link so you can find out more about that too. And all of the recipes we send out every Wednesday on our Substack. There's a link to subscribe to that as well in our show notes.
Well, this has been fun, Sonia. Until next time.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks for being our food friend.
If you enjoyed our podcast, please subscribe, leave us a review, and share this episode with friends. We love hearing from you, so follow us on Instagram or drop us a line at foodfriendspodcast.com.
Yes, we'd love to hear from you and your food friends. Happy cooking and eating!